To maintain a healthy lower back, we have to make sure that we have a really good hip hinge. And that's the ability to move from our hip and not to move from the vertebrae of our back, either going into flexion or into overextension. So having the pelvis and the spine move together anytime that I'm hinging from the hip, and not having the pelvis move independently of the spine, this would be going into extension, creating that hinge joint, or flexion, also creating hinge joints. And a good way to practice that is starting about a fist distance away from a wall. Begin by locking that rib cage down, and that's going to help us not go into overextension. So if our rib cage is locked down to start, then we're going to move our pelvis and our spine together and not independently. So deep breath, lock that rib cage down, send my hips back. If I touch the wall, then that means I'm sending my hips back. And as long as I'm sending my hips back, I'm making sure that I'm rotating at the pelvis. If at any point I stop sending my hips back, then I'm rotating from the spine. So if my hips aren't moving back towards an object, I'm going into flexion from the spine. But if I keep sending my hips back, then I'm rotating at the pelvis. And we want to make sure that we're neutral everywhere and that our pelvis continues to rotate as our spine rotates, that they're moving together, that they're staying together. So if I pass, I'm going to move a little bit, tiny bit further away, brace my core, lock that rib cage down, press my hips back. And if you have really tight hamstrings or glutes, you might not be able to send your hips back anymore. We want to make sure that we're not bending the knees to get lower and turning into a squat pattern, but that we continue only to move as far as our range of motion allows us to. If you touch the wall, then you can move a little bit further away. Always start by locking that rib cage down, sending the hips back. It's really helpful to have a coach or somebody watch you to make sure you're doing it correctly. So for me, right about there is pretty close to my end range, and then squeezing the glutes to come out of it. So really having a good hip hinge, so that just as we're moving throughout our daily life, that we're hinging correctly and not like overextending, and that we're not like going into flexion to pick things up. And then as we're doing movements in our workouts, whether it's like a kettlebell swing or a deadlift or squats, that we're hinging at the hip properly and not going into overextension to lead the movement and not going into flexion at any part of the movement. And then finally, that we're using the glutes and the hamstrings to create that extension, and that we're training strong glutes and hamstrings so that we can protect our lower back. So get really good at the hip hinge, and that will help you to have a healthy lower back.